A 19-year-old mother vanished from her bedroom while her 9-month-old baby slept just feet away, leaving behind a scene of violence that would haunt investigators for 35 years. But when a cutting-edge DNA laboratory in Texas reopens the case, they discover something that changes everything and reveals the shocking truth about who was living right under everyone's nose. December 2nd, 1988 started like any other winter day in Three Rivers, Michigan. The small town, nestled in the southwestern part of the state, was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and violent crime was virtually unheard of. Snow dusted the quiet residential streets, and the holiday season was beginning to fill the air with anticipation and warmth. CATHY SWARTZ was 19 years old, a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She had shoulder-length brown hair, bright eyes that sparkled with laughter, and a smile that could light up any room she entered. Those who knew CATHY described her as caring, determined, and absolutely devoted to her 9-month-old daughter, Courtney. CATHY lived with her fiancé, Mike Warner, in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. The couple had been planning their wedding and looking forward to building a life together as a family. Mike worked long hours to support them, often leaving early in the morning and returning in the evening. CATHY stayed home with baby Courtney, finding joy in the simple moments of motherhood, feeding times, first smiles, and the peaceful quiet of nap time. The apartment was small, but filled with love. Toys scattered across the living room floor, baby bottles drying by the kitchen sink, and photographs of their growing family adorning the walls. CATHY had transformed the spare bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and hanging mobile stars above the crib. She spent hours reading to Courtney, singing lullabies, and planning for their future. Friends and family remember CATHY as someone who always put others first. She volunteered at the local community center when she could find childcare, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and never missed sending birthday cards to distant relatives. Her mother Dorothy lived just 20 minutes away and visited frequently, often finding CATHY on the floor playing peekaboo with Courtney or teaching her daughter new words. Mike Warner, 23 years old, worked at a manufacturing plant outside of town. He was known as a reliable employee who never missed a shift and often volunteered for overtime to bring in extra money for his growing family. Co-workers described him as quiet but friendly, someone who talked proudly about his fiancée and baby daughter during lunch breaks. He carried photographs in his wallet and would show them to anyone who asked about his family. The couple met through mutual friends at a local diner 2 years earlier. CATHY was working as a waitress while finishing her high school diploma through night classes. Mike came in regularly for coffee after his shift, and their friendship gradually blossomed into romance. When CATHY discovered she was pregnant, Mike proposed immediately, eager to build a proper family together. Their relationship was solid, built on mutual respect and shared dreams. They talked about buying a house someday, maybe having more children, and growing old together. Mike had recently started looking at engagement rings, planning to upgrade the simple band he had given CATHY when they first got engaged. She wore it proudly, twisting it around her finger when she was nervous or excited. CATHY's daily routine was predictable and peaceful. She woke up early with Courtney, prepared bottles and breakfast, then spent the morning playing and reading. Afternoons were for household chores while the baby napped, and evenings were family time when Mike returned from work. She loved cooking dinner for the three of them, even though their budget was tight and meals were often simple. The neighborhood where they lived was quiet and safe. Children rode bicycles in the streets. Neighbors chatted over backyard fences, and front doors were often left unlocked. Crime was rare, limited to occasional vandalism or minor theft. The idea that something violent could happen in their peaceful community seemed impossible to residents who had lived there for generations. December 2nd, 1988 was supposed to be just another ordinary day in their ordinary life. Mike kissed CATHY goodbye that morning as usual, promising to be home by 6 o'clock for dinner. CATHY waved from the window, holding Courtney in her arms, both of them still in their pajamas. It was the last time Mike would see his fiancée alive. Mike Warner left for work that Friday morning at 7:30, just as he had done hundreds of times before. The December air was crisp and cold, his breath visible in small puffs as he walked to his car. CATHY stood at the apartment window with Courtney, waving goodbye as he pulled out of the driveway. The baby gurgled and pressed her tiny hands against the glass, a sight that never failed to make Mike smile as he drove away. The manufacturing plant where Mike worked was located 15 miles outside Three Rivers, a 40-minute drive through rural farmland and small communities. He clocked in at 8:15, grabbed his coffee from the break room, and settled into another day of routine work. His supervisor later confirmed that Mike was present for his entire shift, working steadily without any unusual behavior or extended breaks. Meanwhile, Cathy began her typical morning routine. She bathed Courtney in the small plastic tub in the kitchen sink, the baby splashing and laughing as warm water cascaded over her tiny body. After drying and dressing her daughter in a pink outfit with small flower patterns, Cathy prepared a bottle and settled into the rocking chair in the living room for feeding time. The apartment was quiet except for the soft sounds of Courtney drinking her formula and the occasional creak of the rocking chair. Cathy hummed softly, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her years earlier. Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, casting gentle patterns on the carpet. Everything was peaceful, normal, exactly as it should be. Around 10 o'clock, Cathy called her mother Dorothy, as she did most mornings. They chatted about holiday plans, Courtney's latest developments, and whether Cathy needed anything from the grocery store. Dorothy offered to visit that afternoon, but Cathy declined, explaining that she planned to clean the apartment and maybe bake cookies if Courtney took a long nap. "I love you, Mom," Cathy said before hanging up. Those would be the last words Dorothy would ever hear from her daughter. Neighbors later reported seeing Cathy that morning, briefly stepping outside to retrieve mail from the box near their front door. She wore a blue bathrobe and slippers, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She waved to Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived across the street and was tending to her flower garden despite the cold weather. She seemed perfectly normal, Mrs. Henderson would later tell police. Happy and relaxed, just like always. She blew a kiss toward the baby's room window when she went back inside. The lunch hour passed quietly. Cathy prepared a simple meal for herself, while Courtney played in her high chair, banging plastic spoons against the tray and babbling in the language only babies understand. The kitchen radio played soft music, and Cathy occasionally danced a few steps while washing dishes or wiping down counters. By 2 o'clock, Courtney was ready for her afternoon nap. Cathy carried her daughter to the nursery, changed her diaper, and laid her gently in the crib. She wound up the mobile with its rotating stars and moons, humming along to the gentle melody as Courtney's eyes grew heavy. Within minutes, the baby was sleeping peacefully. Cathy closed the nursery door softly and returned to the living room. She had planned to vacuum the carpets and maybe start preparing ingredients for dinner. Mike had mentioned wanting spaghetti and meatballs, one of his favorite meals, and something Cathy enjoyed making from scratch. But somewhere between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock that evening, everything went horribly wrong. When Mike arrived home from work at 6:15, he immediately noticed that something was different. The apartment was too quiet. Usually, Cathy would be in the kitchen preparing dinner, and he could hear her humming or talking to Courtney. The television might be playing children's programs, or music would be drifting from the radio. Instead, there was only silence. Mike called out as he entered through the front door, hanging his coat on the hook by the entrance. "Cathy, I'm home." No response came from anywhere in the apartment. He checked the kitchen first, expecting to find her cooking, but the room was empty. Ingredients for dinner remained untouched on the counter, exactly where she had left them earlier. Growing concerned, Mike walked toward the bedroom, calling Cathy's name again. The door was partially closed, which was unusual. Cathy typically left it open during the day to hear Courtney if she woke from her nap. Mike pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene that greeted him would be forever burned into his memory. Cathy lay motionless on the bedroom floor, her body positioned near the foot of the bed. Blood stained the carpet around her head and neck. Her clothing was disheveled, and it was immediately clear that she was not breathing. Mike dropped to his knees beside her, frantically checking for any signs of life, but it was too late. His fiancée, the mother of his child, the woman he planned to marry, was gone. In that moment of horror and panic, Mike's thoughts immediately turned to Courtney. Racing from the bedroom, he ran to the nursery and threw open the door. Relief flooded through him as he saw his 9-month-old daughter standing in her crib, very much alive and apparently unharmed. She had awakened from her nap and was looking around with curious eyes, unaware of the tragedy that had occurred just rooms away. Mike scooped Courtney into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest as he struggled to process what he had discovered. His hands shook as he reached for the telephone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? My fiancée is dead, Mike managed to say, his voice breaking. Someone killed her, please send help. The emergency dispatcher kept Mike on the line, asking questions and providing instructions while police and paramedics rushed to the scene. Mike sat in the living room, still holding Courtney, staring at the bedroom door and trying to understand how something so horrific could happen in their safe, quiet neighborhood. Within minutes of Mike's frantic phone call, Three Rivers became the center of intense police activity. Squad cars arrived with sirens wailing, followed immediately by paramedics and the county coroner. The quiet residential street where CATHY SWARTZ had lived her peaceful life was suddenly transformed into a crime scene buzzing with investigators, forensic technicians, and curious neighbors gathering behind yellow tape. Detective Robert Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the department, took charge of the investigation. Morrison had worked numerous homicide cases throughout his career, but the brutal murder of a young mother in such a typically safe community shook him deeply. As he surveyed the crime scene, Morrison knew this case would require every resource at his disposal. The bedroom where CATHY's body was discovered told a horrific tale. She had been strangled with such force that bruising was visible around her neck. Her throat had been cut with a sharp object, though no weapon was found at the scene. The bedroom showed signs of a struggle. Furniture was overturned, personal items were scattered across the floor, and blood evidence suggested that CATHY had fought desperately for her life. Forensic technicians carefully documented every detail of the crime scene. They photographed the bedroom from multiple angles, collected blood samples, and dusted for fingerprints on every surface that might yield evidence. The investigation would later reveal that the killer had left behind two crucial pieces of evidence that would prove instrumental decades later. The first piece of evidence was a clear fingerprint on a pink telephone that sat on the nightstand beside CATHY's bed. The print was well defined and complete, suggesting that the perpetrator had handled the phone at some point during or after the attack. The second piece of evidence was a bloody footprint in the bathroom adjoining the bedroom, indicating that the killer had stepped in blood and then walked across the tile floor. Detective Morrison immediately began interviewing Mike Warner, following standard protocol in domestic violence cases. Statistically, intimate partners are often responsible for such crimes, and investigators needed to rule out Mike as a suspect before expanding their search. The interview revealed that Mike had been at work during the entire time frame when the murder occurred, with multiple witnesses and time clock records confirming his alibi. Co-workers at the manufacturing plant provided statements verifying that Mike had been present and working normally throughout his shift. His supervisor confirmed that Mike had not left the facility at any point during the day and had seemed completely normal in his behavior and demeanor. When Mike received the devastating news about CATHY, his shock and grief appeared genuine to everyone who witnessed his reaction. The investigation then turned to the neighborhood, where detectives began conducting door-to-door interviews with residents. The conversations revealed that Three Rivers was indeed the quiet, safe community that its reputation suggested. Most neighbors knew each other by name, children played freely in the streets, and violent crime was virtually unknown. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who had waved to CATHY that morning, provided valuable information about the timeline. She confirmed seeing CATHY around 10 o'clock, appearing happy and relaxed as she collected her mail. Henderson had been tending to her garden throughout most of the day and had not noticed any unusual activity around the SWARTZ apartment. Several neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the area during the preceding weeks, but none could provide detailed descriptions or license plate numbers. The rural nature of the community meant that strangers were often noticed, but residents typically assumed they were visiting friends or family members and thought nothing of their presence. The forensic evidence collection process took several days. Every fingerprint found in the apartment was compared against known databases, but the print on the pink telephone yielded no immediate matches. The bloody footprint was measured and analyzed for size and pattern, providing investigators with information about the likely height and weight of the perpetrator. DNA testing technology was in its infancy in 1988, but investigators collected biological evidence from the crime scene with the hope that future advances might eventually provide answers. Blood samples that did not belong to CATHY were carefully preserved, along with any other potential sources of genetic material that might identify the killer. Detective Morrison and his team interviewed dozens of people during the initial investigation. They spoke with CATHY's family members, friends from high school, co-workers from her previous job at the diner, and anyone else who might have information about potential threats or suspicious behavior. The interviews painted a consistent picture of a young woman who was well-liked, had no known enemies, and lived a quiet life focused on her family. CATHY's mother, Dorothy, provided investigators with details about her daughter's daily routine and recent activities. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. CATHY had not mentioned feeling threatened or unsafe, had not reported any strange phone calls or unwanted attention, and had not expressed concerns about anyone in her life. The investigation expanded to include registered sex offenders in the area, individuals with histories of violence against women, and anyone who might have had access to the apartment building. Detectives checked with local businesses to see if anyone had noticed suspicious behavior or made unusual purchases that might be connected to the crime. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to lose momentum. Despite extensive efforts, police had not identified any solid suspects or developed any promising leads. The fingerprint and footprint evidence remained unmatched, and without DNA technology capable of processing the biological evidence, investigators had exhausted their immediate options. The case remained active, but Detective Morrison knew that without new evidence or witnesses coming forward, the investigation would eventually be relegated to the growing pile of unsolved cases that haunted every police department. For the family and friends of CATHY SWARTZ, the lack of answers only deepened their pain and frustration. As 1989 dawned, the investigation into CATHY SWARTZ's murder had officially entered what law enforcement calls the cold case phase. Detective Morrison continued to work the case when time permitted, but without new leads or evidence, progress became virtually impossible. The file grew thicker with reports and interviews, but the core mystery remained unsolved. Who had brutally murdered a young mother in broad daylight, and why? For Mike Warner, life became an impossible balance between grief and responsibility. He was now a single father to 9-month-old Courtney, trying to raise a daughter while processing the traumatic loss of the woman he had planned to marry. The apartment where they had lived as a family became unbearable, filled with memories and the knowledge of what had happened in the bedroom where CATHY died. Within 3 months of the murder, Mike packed up their belongings and moved to a different town, hoping that distance might help him and Courtney begin to heal. He kept photographs of CATHY throughout their new home, determined that his daughter would grow up knowing about her mother's love and the dreams they had shared as a family. Dorothy, CATHY's mother, became Mike's strongest support system during those difficult early years. She helped with childcare when Mike had to work, shared stories about CATHY's childhood and teenage years, and made sure that Courtney grew up with a connection to her mother's side of the family. The bond between Dorothy and Mike remained strong, united by their shared love for CATHY and their commitment to Courtney's well-being. As Courtney grew from a toddler into a young child, Dorothy and Mike struggled with how much to tell her about her mother's death. They spoke frequently about CATHY's life, her personality, her dreams, and how much she had loved being a mother. But the brutal circumstances of her murder remained a secret that they hoped to share only when Courtney was old enough to process such traumatic information. Detective Morrison retired in 1995, after 7 years of periodically reviewing the SWARTZ case without making significant progress. He passed the file to Detective Linda Patterson, a newer member of the department who brought fresh eyes to the investigation. Patterson reviewed every piece of evidence, re-interviewed key witnesses, and even consulted with FBI profilers, but the case remained stubbornly unsolved. The fingerprint evidence was run through databases multiple times as new prints were added to the system. Law enforcement hoped that someday the perpetrator would be arrested for another crime, and their prints would finally match the evidence from CATHY's murder, but years passed without any positive identification. Throughout the 1990s and into the new millennium, forensic science began advancing rapidly. DNA testing became more sophisticated and reliable, offering new hope for solving old cases. In 2003, Detective Patterson submitted the biological evidence from the SWARTZ case for DNA analysis, hoping that modern technology might finally provide the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for 15 years. The DNA testing revealed a clear genetic profile of the perpetrator, confirming that the biological evidence came from someone other than CATHY or Mike. This was significant progress, but the DNA profile did not match anyone in the criminal database system known as CODIS. The killer's genetic information was now available to investigators, but without a suspect to compare it against, the case remained unsolved. Detective Patterson retired in 2008, 20 years after CATHY's murder. The case file was passed to Detective Mark Stevens, who continued the tradition of reviewing the evidence periodically and submitting the DNA profile whenever the database was updated with new offender information. But matches remained elusive. By this time, Courtney had grown into a young woman who knew the full truth about her mother's death. Mike had finally shared the complete story when she turned 18, explaining not only what had happened, but also the ongoing effort to find justice for CATHY. Courtney struggled with anger, grief, and frustration that her mother's killer remained free after so many years. Social media and true crime interest began bringing new attention to cold cases during the 2010s. Online forums discussed Cathy's murder, with amateur investigators sharing theories and encouraging anyone with information to contact police. The renewed attention generated several tips, but none led to significant developments in the case. The 20th anniversary of Cathy's murder in 2008 prompted local media coverage that reminded the community about the unsolved case. Articles in the newspaper included photographs of Cathy, details about the investigation, and appeals for anyone with information to come forward. The coverage generated phone calls to police, but none provided the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. Courtney, now a mother herself, began speaking publicly about her mother's case. She participated in interviews with local reporters, attended community meetings about unsolved crimes, and advocated for additional resources to be devoted to cold case investigations. Her appearances served to humanize the case and remind people that behind every unsolved murder is a family still seeking answers. "My mother will never get to meet her grandchildren," Courtney told a newspaper reporter in 2015. "She will never see me graduate from college, get married, or accomplish any of the dreams she had for my future. But someone out there knows what happened to her, and I will never stop fighting for justice." Detective Stevens continued working the case even as he approached retirement. He periodically contacted other law enforcement agencies to see if they had any unsolved cases with similar evidence patterns. He consulted with cold case specialists from the state police and attended conferences about new investigative techniques. But despite his dedication and expertise, the case remained frustratingly unsolved. As the 30-year anniversary of Cathy's murder approached in 2018, it seemed possible that the case might never be solved. The original investigators had retired or passed away. Witnesses had moved or died, and physical evidence was aging. Without new technological breakthroughs or unexpected developments, justice for Cathy SWARTZ appeared to be slipping further away with each passing year. But unknown to the family and investigators, revolutionary changes in forensic science were about to transform cold case investigations forever. In 2023, 35 years after Cathy SWARTZ's murder, a specialized forensic laboratory in Texas called Othram Incorporated contacted the Three Rivers Police Department with an offer that would change everything. Othram had developed cutting-edge DNA analysis technology specifically designed to solve cold cases that had been considered impossible to crack using traditional methods. Detective Jennifer Walsh, who had inherited the SWARTZ case from her retired predecessor, was initially skeptical. The case had been reviewed by multiple investigators over the decades, subjected to various DNA analyses, and consulted upon by experts from around the country. What could this Texas laboratory possibly do that had not already been attempted? Kristen Mittelman, Othram's chief business development officer, explained that their laboratory used advanced DNA sequencing technology that could extract genetic information from samples that were previously considered too degraded or contaminated to analyze. Their process could build detailed DNA profiles from microscopic amounts of biological evidence and then use genetic genealogy to identify potential suspects. The key innovation was Othram's ability to create comprehensive genetic profiles that could be compared against publicly available genealogy databases, not just criminal databases. This meant that even if the perpetrator had never been arrested or submitted DNA for any official purpose, investigators might still be able to identify them through family connections and genealogical research. Detective Walsh submitted the biological evidence from Cathy's murder to Othram in March of 2023. The process was complex and time-consuming, requiring several months of laboratory work and genetic analysis. Unlike traditional DNA testing that provided quick results, Othram's advanced techniques required patience and precision. While the laboratory worked on the genetic analysis, Detective Walsh used the waiting period to review the case file once again. She re-examined witness statements, crime scene photographs, and evidence inventories, hoping to identify any details that might have been overlooked during previous investigations. Her fresh perspective, combined with 35 years of accumulated investigative experience, brought new insights to the case. One detail that caught Detective Walsh's attention was a witness statement from 1988 that had been given limited consideration during the original investigation. A neighbor had reported seeing an unfamiliar man walking near the apartment complex on the day of the murder, but the description was vague and the witness was uncertain about the timeline. Detective Walsh decided to re-interview the witness, who was now elderly but still lived in the same neighborhood. The conversation revealed additional details that had not been included in the original statement. The witness remembered that the unfamiliar man had seemed to know his way around the area, suggesting that he was not a complete stranger to the community. In July of 2023, Othram contacted Detective Walsh with extraordinary news. The laboratory had successfully created a detailed genetic profile from the biological evidence and had identified potential family connections through genealogical research. Working with genetic genealogist Cheryl Lapointe, Othram had built a family tree that pointed to a specific suspect. The genetic genealogy process involved comparing the perpetrator's DNA profile against profiles in public genealogy databases like GEDmatch-Pro. When partial matches were found, genealogists could construct family trees and identify individuals who might be related to the person who left DNA at the crime scene. The process required extensive research into family histories, birth records, and other genealogical documents. After weeks of genealogical investigation, the research team had narrowed their focus to 4 brothers who had grown up in the Three Rivers area during the time period when CATHY was murdered. All 4 men would have been adults in 1988, and all had connections to the local community that might have brought them into contact with CATHY. Detective Walsh began investigating the 4 brothers, starting with public record searches and background checks. 3 of the brothers had moved away from Michigan decades earlier and had established lives in other states. Their histories showed no major criminal activity, and further investigation ruled them out as suspects in CATHY's murder. The 4th brother, however, presented a much different profile. Robert Waters, 53 years old, had remained in the general area throughout his adult life and had a history of minor legal troubles. More significantly, Detective Walsh discovered that Waters had known Mike Warner casually and had even visited Mike and Kathy's apartment approximately 1 month before the murder. This connection explained how Waters might have known the layout of the apartment and the couple's daily routines. It also suggested that the murder might not have been a random crime committed by a stranger, but rather a planned attack by someone who had access to information about Kathy's life and schedule. Detective Walsh contacted law enforcement in Beaufort, South Carolina, where Waters had been living for the past several years. She explained the situation and requested assistance in obtaining DNA samples and fingerprints from Waters for comparison against the evidence from Kathy's murder. South Carolina investigators approached Waters at his residence in August of 2023. They explained that he was being investigated in connection with a cold case from Michigan and requested that he provide DNA and fingerprint samples voluntarily. Waters agreed to cooperate, appearing calm and cooperative during the interaction. The samples were immediately sent to forensic laboratories for comparison against the evidence from Kathy's murder scene. Within days, the results confirmed what genetic genealogy had suggested. Robert Waters was the source of both the DNA evidence and the fingerprint found on the pink telephone in Kathy's bedroom. After 35 years of investigation, police finally had definitive proof of who had murdered CATHY SWARTZ. Detective Walsh immediately contacted the prosecutor's office to discuss arrest warrants and charges against Robert Waters. The evidence was overwhelming. His DNA matched the biological samples from the crime scene, his fingerprint matched the print on the pink telephone, and genetic genealogy had provided the scientific foundation that connected him to the murder. On August 15, 2023, Detective Walsh and Michigan State Police investigators traveled to Beaufort, South Carolina, to arrest Robert Waters for the murder of CATHY SWARTZ. They coordinated with local law enforcement to ensure the arrest would proceed smoothly and safely. Waters was at his plumbing business when investigators arrived. He was a successful small business owner, married with children, and had apparently built a respectable life in South Carolina. Co-workers and neighbors knew him as a quiet, hard-working man who rarely discussed his past or his life before moving to the area. When investigators identified themselves and explained that he was under arrest for murder, Waters showed no surprise or shock. He did not protest his innocence, demand to know what evidence they had against him, or ask for clarification about the charges. Instead, he simply nodded and extended his hands to be handcuffed. "I have been waiting for this day for 35 years, Waters said quietly as he was placed in the police vehicle. It was a statement that suggested guilt and possibly relief that his secret was finally exposed. During the transport back to Michigan, Waters remained largely silent. He asked a few questions about the legal process and requested that his family be notified about his arrest, but he did not discuss the case or provide any explanations for his actions. Investigators noted that he seemed resigned to his fate rather than surprised or outraged. Upon arrival in Michigan, Waters was booked into jail and provided with legal representation. The prosecutor's office announced that he would be charged with first-degree murder in connection with CATHY SWARTZ's death. If convicted, he would face the possibility of life in prison without parole. Mike Warner, now in his late 50s, received the call from Detective Walsh on a Tuesday evening. He was at home with his second wife, helping his teenage stepchildren with homework, when his phone rang. The conversation was brief, but life-changing. "We have arrested the man who killed Cathy," Detective Walsh said. "His name is Robert Waters, and he has been charged with her murder." Mike sat down heavily in his kitchen chair, overwhelmed by emotions he had not felt in decades. Relief, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of closure all competed for space in his mind. After 35 years of wondering, worrying, and hoping, justice for Cathy was finally within reach. Courtney, now 36 years old, and a mother of 2 young children, received the news while at work. She had to excuse herself from a meeting and find a private place to process what she was hearing. The man who had murdered her mother, stolen her childhood, and left a hole in her family's life had finally been identified and arrested. "I have been living with this for 36 years, Courtney would later tell reporters. "Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone in my life has been shadowed by the knowledge that my mother's killer was free while we suffered. Finally knowing who did this, and seeing him face justice, means everything to our family." Dorothy, Cathy's mother, was 87 years old when she learned about Waters' arrest. Her health had declined in recent years, and she had often worried that she might die before seeing justice for her daughter. The news brought her both joy and a deep sadness that Cathy would never see her own grandchildren or experience the life she had dreamed of living. The legal proceedings moved forward with Waters remaining in custody, unable to post the high bail that had been set by the court. His defense attorney indicated that they would review the evidence and determine their strategy for the case. The prosecutor expressed confidence that the DNA and fingerprint evidence, combined with the scientific advances that had made the identification possible, would result in a conviction. However, just days after his arrest, Robert Waters was found dead in his jail cell. He had taken his own life during the night, leaving behind a brief note that expressed remorse for his actions, but provided no details about the murder or his motivations. Authorities found devotional pamphlets in his cell, open to pages describing forgiveness and redemption. The suicide eliminated the possibility of a trial and the answers that might have come from Waters' testimony. The family would never learn why he had targeted Cathy, whether the murder was planned or opportunistic, or what had driven him to commit such a brutal crime against a young mother he barely knew. Robert Waters' death by suicide brought a complex mixture of emotions to everyone who had been affected by Cathy SWARTZ's murder. While his arrest had provided the answers and justice that the family had sought for 35 years, his death eliminated the possibility of understanding his motivations or hearing him accept responsibility for his actions. "He is a coward," said Jennifer Outman, one of Cathy's childhood friends, who had remained close to the family throughout the decades. "To take her away from all of us in the manner that he did, and then he got to go live his life for 35 years while we suffered. And when he was finally caught, he took the easy way out instead of facing what he had done." Mike Warner struggled with conflicting emotions about Waters' suicide. Part of him felt relief that the man who had destroyed his life would never be able to hurt anyone else. But part of him had wanted to confront Waters in court, to look him in the eye and ask why he had murdered the woman Mike loved and left their baby daughter without a mother. "I wanted him to explain himself," Mike told reporters. "I wanted to understand what could possibly drive someone to do what he did to Cathy. Now we will never have those answers, and I have to find a way to make peace with that." Courtney found herself processing not only the identification of her mother's killer, but also the realization that he had been living freely for her entire life. While she was growing up wondering about her mother, starting school, graduating, getting married, and having children of her own, Robert Waters was building a business, raising a family, and enjoying the normal life that he had stolen from Cathy. "It is difficult to accept that he got to experience all the things my mother never had the chance to do," Courtney explained. "He saw his children grow up, attended their graduations, walked his daughter down the aisle at her wedding, and held his grandchildren. Those are experiences my mother will never have because of what he did to her." The advanced DNA technology that had solved Cathy's case represented a revolutionary development in forensic science. Othrom's techniques had made it possible to extract genetic information from evidence that had been considered unusable for decades. The success of the SWARTZ case demonstrated the potential for solving thousands of other cold cases that had previously seemed hopeless. Detective Walsh became an advocate for using advanced DNA technology in other unsolved cases. She worked with the prosecutor's office and police administration to identify additional cold cases that might benefit from Othrom's analysis. The cost of the advanced testing was significant, But the results in CATHY's case proved that the investment could provide answers that families had been seeking for decades.
We can identify almost any perpetrator anywhere from any case, Kristen Mittleman of Othram had told investigators. The SWARTZ case proved that this was not an empty promise but a realistic assessment of what modern forensic science could accomplish.
The genetic genealogy process that had identified Waters also raised important questions about privacy and the use of genetic information in criminal investigations. The technique relied on publicly available genetic databases that people had contributed to for genealogical research, not criminal investigations. While the results had brought justice for CATHY's family, some privacy advocates expressed concerns about the implications of using genetic information in this manner. Dorothy, despite her advanced age and declining health, found new energy in the resolution of her daughter's case. She began speaking at events about cold case investigations and the importance of never giving up hope for justice. Her message resonated with other families who were still waiting for answers about their own lost loved ones. "I never thought I would live to see this day," Dorothy told a gathering of families affected by unsolved crimes. "For 35 years, I went to bed every night, wondering if my daughter's killer was still out there, still free to hurt other people. I worried that I would die without ever knowing who had taken her from us. But science and dedicated investigators made it possible for us to finally have answers." The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence from old crime scenes. The biological samples that ultimately identified Waters had been carefully stored for 35 years, waiting for technology to advance enough to make analysis possible. Without the foresight of the original investigators who preserved every possible piece of evidence, the case could never have been solved. Courtney began working with other families of murder victims, sharing her experience and providing support for those still seeking justice. She understood the unique pain of growing up without answers, the difficulty of processing grief when fundamental questions remain unanswered, and the complex emotions that come with finally learning the truth after decades of uncertainty. "My mother was 19 years old when she was murdered," Courtney reflected. "She was just beginning her life, just starting to build the family she dreamed of having. She will never get to see me succeed in my career, never get to meet her grandchildren, never get to experience the life she was working so hard to build. But now we know who took that away from her, and we know that he can never hurt anyone else." The resolution of CATHY SWARTZ's murder after 35 years demonstrated that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. While Robert Waters escaped accountability for most of his life, advanced forensic science eventually caught up with him and provided the answers that CATHY's family deserved. For the Three Rivers community, the case brought closure to a tragedy that had haunted residents for decades. The knowledge that CATHY's killer had been identified and could no longer pose a threat provided a sense of safety and resolution that had been missing since 1988. The case became a symbol of hope for families dealing with unsolved crimes and a testament to the dedication of investigators who never stopped working to find answers. It proved that even the oldest and most challenging cases could be solved with the right combination of preserved evidence, advanced technology, and determined investigation. The resolution of CATHY SWARTZ's case after 35 years proves that hope should never be abandoned, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. If you found this account meaningful, please share it with others who might benefit from hearing about the power of persistence and the incredible advances in forensic science that are bringing justice to families around the world. Your engagement helps ensure that more stories like CATHY's can be told, and that other families still waiting for answers know they are not forgotten.